Hello and welcome. My name is Brent Sadler and I'm the Senior Research Fellow at Heritage Foundation, responsible for naval warfare issues. I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues today to discuss Navy's role in great power competition with a focus on the military-economic nexus. This is a timely topic given Chinese increasingly bellicose rhetoric and coercive naval behavior in the South China Sea, backed by accelerating investments in the so-called maritime Silk Road. Also, within the past month, Russia recently gained rights to a new naval base in Sudan, both marking significant increases in investment and military commercial presence along vital shipping lanes, potentially influencing key allies and partners. Our discussion also comes on the heels of yesterday's release of the Navy's Future Naval Force Study that provides a 30-year plan for the Navy's future growth to a fleet of upwards of 546 manned and unmanned ships by 2045. Thank you for joining us today, and please do use the features on your screen to pose questions to the panel, as well as respond to several survey questions along the way. Following opening comments by both panelists, taking from your input via the chat boxes on your screen, I will then pose questions to the panel. But before we kick things off, I'll pose a survey question to the audience now. You should see a screen pop up asking, what is today's most urgent task for the U.S. Navy in gray power competition? A, warfighting preparation. B, building capacity and interoperability with partner navies. C, contesting China and Russia gray zone activities. Or D, something else. Before continuing, I'll give you a moment to respond and then show you the results. And there are the results. It looks like a pretty close split between building capacity with our partner navies and contesting the gray zone operations. Thank you, Catherine. We'll go back to video. We'll come back to that question at the end of the discussion. But first, let me introduce my two colleagues who will be joining me. They are well placed to discuss how these activities by China and Russia impact our nation and Navy. Dr. Gresh has traveled extensively and written most recently on the geoeconomics behind China's and Russia's maritime activities across the Indo-Asia Pacific in his book, To Rule Eurasia's Waves. Dr. Gresh is currently a professor of international security studies at the National Defense University's College of International Security Affairs here in Washington, D.C. As a government employee, I must also stress that his views expressed today are personal opinions and do not represent the official policy of the Department of Defense nor National Defense University. Dr. Weitz has firsthand experience in the maritime business world, advising entrepreneurs and startups, and as president of the Institute for Global Maritime Studies, seeking practical solutions to global maritime challenges. And he has written on these issues for the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, as well as the Straits Times of Singapore, among others. He is also a professor and director of the Maritime Studies program at Tufts University. And now, on to the show. Dr. Gresh, over to you.
Brent, thanks very much. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Heritage Foundation for hosting us today. I want to kickstart my remarks thinking about this, this notion of geoeconomics. And we think about geoeconomics, it's very much economic statecraft, or the use of economic means to pursue foreign policy goals. And within that, I think there's a real role for the Navy to play. If you think about, the whole spectrum of tools in the toolbox, three in particular really come to mind when thinking about the US Navy's operations, forward-thinking strategy. The first being investment policy. And specifically within this, the role of basing where we are placed around the globe. The second has to do with the cybersphere, submarine cables that line the ocean's floors around the globe that connect us, every country around the world. And the third has to do with aid. To the first point on investment policy, the challenge, I think, for the United States Navy, for the United States writ large, is dealing with, when it comes to China specifically, how we see, as they increasingly grow this global port access, the first base in Djibouti, having these access nodes, and how this can then spill over into dual use capabilities. And it started with Djibouti many years ago, of course, being involved in counter-piracy operations, and then spilling over into what they established now today with their first overseas base. And you saw it too, in another case where you continue to watch out for in Piraeus, Greece, for example. I had the opportunity to travel there last fall and to see, currently it's a shipping port, and they've done, the Chinese in particular, Costco Shipping has done a really excellent job of, uh, making it a much stronger, more efficient regional port. But as pointed out to me, the possibility for, in the winter months, for example, of having the cruise ship terminal also host or be a place where warships can come. So I think that the Chinese are being very smart about using the economics first, or the geoeconomics first, to then move in a security element. And it makes sense, right, that any country wants to defend and secure their interests. But I think for the United States perspective, again, as someone who's studied a lot of base politics, and you look at the latest base structure report put out in 2018, I think is the latest one, where it says that the United States has approximately 500 or 512 main operating bases around the world. And so I think moving forward, especially in a financially constrained environment, the United States is going to have to think about where bases are placed. And that thus, feeds into the conversation. We know the news coming out in the last couple of weeks about, dividing the Seventh Fleet, creating, or not necessarily dividing, but moving or creating a first fleet that would borrow potentially from the third and the seventh fleets. It remains to be seen if that'll happen. But I think this is part of the conversation moving forward that the United States will very much have to engage in. The second one, cybersphere. As few people greatly appreciate, there are only approximately 200 submarine cables that line the ocean floors that connect us globally. 95% of all the information that we receive goes through these submarine cable networks. Only about 5% goes through satellite. And if you think in a place again like Djibouti, a small, tiny nation that has an estimated 7 or 8 cables that come up through and enter into Djibouti and route to the rest of Africa, like a lot of other elements in this larger geoeconomic competition. So I think for the U.S. Navy to think more about how, securing the infrastructure, but also understanding and supporting when lines are cut, or understanding what's going on at this, the subsurface level, to really secure and focus on these 200 lines is pretty remarkable to think about. And furthermore, the Chinese have been very smart about, they've laid this peace cable, which stands for the Pakistan East Africa Connect to Europe cable, or what's called the CME-WE cable, which is Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Western Europe, running these resilient lines to further connect in this, worst case scenario where other internet cables are going out. So that's, I think, a second important element. And the third one has to do with aid. And I think the Navy certainly could play a very important role in this on the softer side through naval diplomatic means. And I think one, especially coming from NDU, certainly I greatly appreciate the international exchange programs, sending over officers, through education and training. I also think it would, benefit, which we saw, over the past decade, the AFPAC Hands program, but also thinking about doing an Indo-PACOM Hands program or a China Hands program as a way to really invest in the knowledge capital of the U.S. Navy. But on top of that, the continuation of ship visits, intelligence sharing, all these elements, fall into this larger aid category, and I think something very much that the U.S. Navy can think further about moving forward into the next administration. With that, back to you, Brent, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gresh. Before we proceed on, I've got a second survey question. Catherine, if you could tee it up. You should see it pop up on your screen momentarily. And there it is. Can or should the U.S. Navy play a more active role in a comprehensive geoeconomic strategy in great power competition? A, yes, B, no, or C, not sure. Overwhelmingly, it looks like the survey, the consensus is yes, with the next group being a not sure. Now, before we continue on to the next discussing the panel member, Dr. Weitz, if you can join me on screen, I'll turn it over to you for your opening comments.
Great. Thank you, Brent, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for putting this on. Wanted to also give a couple shout outs, one to the U.S.-Japan Leadership Program, where I met Brent, and Jeffrey and I both participated, and also to the Fletcher School's PhD program, which I'm a product of, and so is Dr. Gresh. So it is an honor to be here, and I'm going to focus my comments on the commercial side, the global supply chains, commercial diplomacy, and then non-state threats to security, and how there might be potential areas where great power competition can be enhanced while we're also tackling that latter threat. So start off with global supply chains. So COVID-19 put a pause on global trade flows to the extent that we haven't seen since World War II. And it uncovered many vulnerabilities from private supply chains that you wouldn't normally know about. And so I think that has gotten the attention not only of policymakers in Washington, but the general population, which I view as an opportunity for the Navy to demonstrate why, as it secures our global sea lanes, things that we took for granted before 2020, the stability of global supply chains, we need to think about. And when we think about recapitalizing the US Navy, there are many strategic reasons for doing that. And so some of the vulnerabilities uncovered, things like pharmaceutical drug shortages, PPE, automobile parts, some of that will be, I think, in this upcoming period, tackled by some strategic reshoring of industries. And it'll be interesting to see in Washington how we take that awareness and also look at how we build out our shipbuilding capability in the United States. Before I move on to commercial diplomacy in general, I'll make one last point, which I think global changes in the international order tend to happen in waves. So for example, shortly after World War II, from 1945 to 1949, we saw things like the formation of NATO, the formation of the United Nations, the efforts to liberalize global trade, the Marshall Plan, a lot of changes in a very rapid period. And we also saw domestic policymaking changes like the Truman Doctrine. I suspect that 2020 to 2024 will be a similar situation. Right now, we face a multipolar world, but different from last time we had a truly multipolar world before World War II. Most of the major great powers are either nuclear powers or nuclear capable, like Japan is, could easily become nuclear capable, so is Germany. We also have rapidly changing technologies that are disrupting the status quo of naval power, things like missile technology, autonomous vehicles, aerial, surface, and subsurface. And then we have global challenges like the melting Arctic sea ice that provide new areas where we need to think about how we have a presence. So essentially, the key takeaway of that first point is there's lots of change in the world, and that presents both challenges and opportunities for the Navy. Now let's look at commercial diplomacy. Dr. Gresh talked a lot about this, and I would just add the following. The PRC, given its governance nature, has one advantage in that it's a little bit more coordinated than we are in the United States, as well as with our allies. So, for example, let's look at their Belt and Road Initiative as well as their Polar Silk Road Initiative. There's essentially a government mandate that this is an important area of national investment. That then is a clue to their state-owned enterprises to move into there and do infrastructure investments, not with an official state guarantee, but with certainly support. And then they have a massive amount of sovereign wealth funds, and that those then follow. So that's something that we see, a highly coordinated effort for infrastructure investment and commercial diplomacy that's coordinated with their foreign ministry, defense ministry, and that's something we need to be aware of and think about how we counter that with the United States and its allies. And then let's talk about piracy. So piracy is one of many non-state armed group threats to the global shipping industry. And I'm gonna suggest that investments to shore up the United States position in great power competition can have a double benefit of doing that while also having a presence to combat these transnational threats. So, for example, a lot of piracy has happened historically in recent history around the Horn of Africa. That the Red Sea is also a zone of competition now, with Russia signing a long-term basing agreement for Port Sudan, and all of the different powers, including China, with bases in Djibouti. So a stronger U.S. Sea services presence there can help counter that, as well as the piracy threats that have historically emanated out of Somalia, but may come out of Yemen. And that same situation applies for the Strait of Hormuz, for Malacca Strait, Gulf of Guinea, near Nigeria. So the last 2 points I want to make to help trigger some interesting conversation is, in addition to more naval assets, I also think the United States would benefit greatly from more Coast Guard assets. Andrew Erickson at the Naval War College has written about China's 3 maritime groupings: their Navy, the PLA Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, and their maritime militia. And to counter that, especially their growing Coast Guard, which is now the world's largest by number of ships, I think we need a larger U.S. Coast Guard. And you can see that Japan's investing in its Coast Guard. So that's something for us to think about. And I also think we should think about the possibilities of thinking differently in this financially constrained post-COVID environment. How can we get more boats out there for lower cost? And one idea would be a modern PT boat. And this would be both good for the US Navy from a distributed lethality perspective, as well as the US Marine Corps for amphibious operations. So with that, I'll stop talking. Look forward to the conversation. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much. And I've got one more survey question. Catherine, if you can go ahead and queue it up, you shall see it pop on the screen. And that question is, where is Navy's presence most urgently needed today? And in the context of our discussion today, first would be the North Atlantic and the Arctic, Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea, or South China Sea, or Northeast Asia, considering East China Sea and Sea of Japan, and then finally, the Indian Ocean region writ large. So not too unsurprising given recent events, South China Sea is the place for the Navy to be, with Northeast Asia as a close second, or not, well, slightly distant second, but definitely I would read into that as a focus in on China. I think now we're going to shift over into a moderated discussion. If I could ask both Dr. Gresh and Dr. Weitz to join me on screen. I'll go ahead and pose a few questions to the group. The first question is actually for you, Dr. Gresh, and it is, here's the question. And again, I appreciate the audience. I've actually tried to consolidate many of your comments as this has been going, but it's been a deluge. So don't take offense if I don't get to yours specifically, but I'm weaving them together. So for you, Dr. Gresh, how can Navy contest the economic effects of China's maritime strategy? In your book, you give several good examples and anecdotal evidence of this. Could you provide us some further insights on this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think one of we've talked about this too, Brent, is, you know, there's a lot of discussion about supporting partners and allies, right? But I think we need to kind of push that further, because what does that mean exactly? And obviously I've referred to in the book and in the piece I just wrote this past week, looking at the Malabar exercise, right? Which is pretty significant in the sense that for the first time since 2007, Australia was included, Japan was, included as a permanent member in 2015, the United States always being a member. This is, a wonderful show of force, but as I also point out, this is in juxtaposition to what China and Russia have been doing in their joint sea exercises taking place in the far western periphery of Eurasia and Western Europe, in the Baltic Sea in 2017, and the Mediterranean in 2015, as well as other important exercises in East Asia. So I think the more the United States can do, or the Navy specifically, of building partner capacity. I think there's a huge spillover effect that we can see in terms of generating greater political goodwill for then other instruments of power that the US government has at its disposal. So I think, and again, it gets back to my initial comments about the great importance of education, of training programs, of really reaching out to smaller actors like, currently right now at NDU, I have, a slew of different countries represented, from places like the Maldives or the Seychelles or Mauritius. These critical countries, although small, but when you look at maps of the Indian Ocean, the shipping lanes traverse right through the Maldives. So these sorts of initiatives, I think, are going to be critical moving forward. Over to you.
No, I appreciate that. I really enjoyed also in your book where you talked about firsthand your experiences in Djibouti. And another friend of all of ours, who's now the Japanese ambassador in Djibouti, just posted a photograph of a U.S. Navy ship, a Japanese maritime self-defense ship, as well as a Chinese Liberation Navy ship pulling into the port of Djibouti from what looks like his office. So exciting things in Djibouti, a place where the economics and the military all are coming together. And Rocky, I'm getting a lot of really good questions about your comment on the Coast Guard. So the question I want to kind of pivot over to you, and also a lot of interesting remarks and suggestions about World War II histories. I think most of it is centered on the Solomon Islands and our PT boats, the designs and the employment of those, mostly in a military context. But I would like to kind of pivot to you and dig a little bit more on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Specifically its Maritime Silk Road. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on how this differs from a normal economic or a trade policy? And if you've got any good examples in the maritime that you can maybe kind of dig a little deeper in on for us.
Sure, I'm happy to. So the global shipping industry is one of those where lots of international investment happens. So for example, Singapore is a major investor in global port operations worldwide. So is Dubai. And so what's different from those commercial relationships versus the Belt and Road Initiative is kind of the either direct or indirect expectations for other expectations from whoever is receiving the investment. And so I find the Belt and Road Initiative, and the same for the Polar Silk Road, which is up in the northern sea routes, mostly looking to build infrastructure to extract Russian natural resources down to China. There's significant government backing, either overt subsidies or unofficial subsidies, and that provides more diplomatic benefit to China than you would, say, get from a Singaporean investment in a port.
Well, thank you very much. And a few more questions are kind of coming in. And before I pivot on to that and capture it, I would want to draw the audience attention to the BUILD Act, which was passed a couple of years ago, which actually expanded the amount of risk that could be put into political securities for U.S. businesses wanting to invest overseas. We can come back to that, maybe your reactions to that. To date, my impression is that's a latent capability that hasn't been utilized in this kind of dynamic, in the maritime and in great power competition. Even though the mandate in 2018, when the bill was passed, it seemed to point in that direction. So for both of you, with that already in the back of your mind, the question was posed to several different audience members: what activities would or should the Navy do? Exercises being one. And I know, Dr. Gresh, you gave some good examples on a macro level, but I'm at the ship level. So it's for what could the Navy do that would be beneficial? Something comes to mind like port visits as an economic tool, or the timing of the location of exercises, which could either entice or scare away potential investors in a location. Over to you. I don't know which one of you would like to go first, but maybe over to you first, Dr. Gresh.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at it. It's a great question, and I'll use actually an example of what the PRC did when they conducted their joint sea exercise again, 2017 in the Baltic for the first time. What did they do thereafter? They took a grand tour of Western Europe, and it was significant to see the photos of the PLA, the planned ships in London for the first time. And so I think to your point about the soft power nature, the spillover effect from a naval diplomatic visit, and it doesn't need to be enormous ships. Again, we're talking most of these nations, have small navies, but I think just the significant presence of the U.S. Navy has incredible, power in its own right. And I think, I harken back, I was reading up and seeing the proposed change to now, which will be called, I guess, the Atlantic Fleet. And it harkens back to what Teddy Roosevelt did, 1907, deploying the Great White Fleet around the world to show that we are almighty, we are powerful. And so I think this might be something to think about. And I think part of the challenge for anybody in the U.S. military are the seam issues. And we see this front and center when it comes to the Indian Ocean, right? Of seeing the seam between CENTCOM and INDOPACOM. And again, the impetus behind wanting to figure out a way to kind of, with the fleet being overstretched, where can we think about reconfiguring our basing structure so that we can really have more of a seamless trajectory? And I think, again, it gets at how, hey, send a fleet around the world to Europe, to some of these smaller nations. For the Great White Fleet, it visited 20 different ports over 14 months of saying, hey, we're here. We haven't forgotten about you. You are a valued partner or ally. I think could go a long way.
Uh, just one interjection. It also, the statement of capacity and size matters, and I'll come back to that. But first, over to you, Dr. White, for your comments.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. I agree with what Jeffrey said. I think the power of naval diplomacy is well known, and we have 120 years of history there, or longer if you include other nations, of course. Even our USS Constitution did that back in the 1840s. Here's an interesting idea. I think that in 2020, in many ways, China overplayed its hand. The border dispute in the Himalayas with India, the tensions with Vietnam, and its actions in Hong Kong have made a lot of its neighbors nervous. When you look at the U.S. Navy and its allies and partners, it's the most formidable force in the world. And one thing that I think the new administration could really look at is, rather than us as the Navy, U.S. Navy or U.S. Coast Guard, our sea services out there try to do global port visits, what if we had, rather than just exercises with the Japanese, Indians, Australians, NATO allies, what if we had a multinational, a set of multinational cruises where, just like what Jeffrey was saying, wow, look, there's a PRC Navy vessel in London. Look, there's a bunch of NATO countries visiting Vietnam at the same time that the U.S. Navy in Japan is there. That's a pretty powerful statement. And I think that's something that is an underutilized opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. I kind of want to push a little bit more with both of you. There's some more comments coming in on the small boats and how actually those would be employed. I want to come back to, but I want to push a little bit further on the economic side of that. So Dr. Weitz, from your experience, and you've been in the business where you've looked at opportunities for investing yourself, is there a situation where a Navy presence could have a chilling effect on the economics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would have to be coordinated with other efforts. And I am eager to give some thoughts on the small boat piece. So I'll just throw out a few things. I think that given the rapid evolutions of anti-ship missiles and the ability of what would a modern PT boat would be very stealthy with some kind of plastic coating, composite coating, that having, say, 200 of those with a marine detail and some of the existing anti-ship missiles that we have would be a cost-effective way of really putting, especially the PRC, back on their heels. And those, so I think there's all kinds of interesting opportunities. One commercial aspect of that is there are U.S. companies. There's a company, Hamilton, down in Texas, that's looking at supporting the offshore oil industry with a patrol boat that would be a dual use. And this would be a new U.S. shipyard, et cetera. And I think that if we can think creatively in the next 4 years, as we're in this period post-COVID, of how do we get more with less? How do we leverage the fact that we have actually a lot of shipbuilders in the Gulf region from Texas to Louisiana that serve the offshore oil industry, could potentially really build out our shipbuilding capability in addition to the existing shipbuilders, and particularly for these small boats. I think that those are sorts of things that we need to start having those kind of creative conversations as a country. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But I think it's a really interesting idea.
Before I weigh in, Dr. Gresh, did you have anything to add to that?
So I think, I agree with Rocky, and I think another thing to think about, in addition to just ships, and we talk a lot about this, and that is really just the technology and specifically anti-access aerial denial. And there's a lot in the press and a lot of studies on the South China Sea, for example. But I think, moving over back to the Indian Ocean again, when I visited India and Sri Lanka, there was a lot of discussion too about the real concern when it comes to Pakistan or Sino-Pakistani relations. Are the Chinese, speculation, of course, but what's going on there? Are they building up the A2AD capabilities? What is India doing in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands? So I think there are ways to move beyond, again, just ship platforms, to see other ways that various partners and allies can benefit from the technological capabilities that we have, and transferring to these various nations is also something to think about.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna weigh in a little bit myself and try and pull in a few of the comments and responses that I'm seeing over on the chat line. So the number one challenge for the Navy, because of our competitors, Russia and China, they're taking advantage of this seam that we've addressed. The Navy's got to find a way to compete both in the day-to-day and the peacetime. This is the gray zone, which the first survey question, I think this crowd definitely gets. But at the same time, it's just as critical. It's not a one-to-end, do this first then this, with any money left over, ships left over, a war fighting. So the Navy has to be built, designed, and structured to do both. It has to have the capacity for both, which we haven't talked about yet. And I'm going to get forewarn both of you guys, your thoughts on the idea of a first fleet. It sounds like the concept would be based in Southeast Asia. Perhaps that's an open debate. Talk with many of the folks in the region, but the focus will be in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. We haven't really talked about that. The role for these smaller vessels and training kind of comes to mind. But I do want to touch on scale, and when the example given about the Great White Fleet, size does matter, but numbers matter too. You think of a swarm, a lot of these smaller boats in a swarm. But from a defense attache's perspective, trying to actualize this from my own personal experience in Southeast Asia, just for our audience's background, when an aircraft carrier pulls into port, it has about upwards of near 5,000 sailors that come in. And usually it's preceded by advanced teams and others. So it's felt. And even in large metropolitan areas where some of these deep water ports are, it's a presence that's felt. And it's a presence not just felt militarily, but also economically, at the local small business leaders. And depending on the host country's politics and government structure, that can actually have a very significant impact, good or bad. So the embassies are always very tied in. But just a ship like that, when it goes to port for on average about 5 days, you're talking an injection into the economy of about $2 million US. And that actually opens doors. It certainly opened a lot of doors and got things done when I was as the defense attaché overseas. So I think that's an example that we talk a lot about the value of port visits of showing the flag, but I would say don't underestimate showing the dollar as well. It's actually both. And increasingly in many of these partners countries, you have to do both. So with that, I kind of want to turn that, with that in mind, doing both, your thoughts and reactions to the first fleet that was put forward by the Secretary of the Navy in just the recent past.
I can take a stab. I think I appreciate the trying to think strategically, more innovatively about how the fleet kind of restructures itself amidst great power competition. That said, and I know Brent, Rocky, you both spent significant amounts of time in Southeast Asia. I was in Singapore last year, and kind of one of the initial takeaways was certainly the United States has access, but it's on a much more informal basis. And I think to your point, Brent, Singapore is not an enormous place. And so the proposals to see, more of a permanent presence, I don't know, but I think you gestured towards, well, maybe there are other parts of Southeast Asia. And I think one of the places that is not as developed in terms of just from a relationship standpoint, that of Indonesia. And I think India has been really smart. As I cite in 2018, Modi made an important visit. They signed, the Indonesian and Indian government signed a defense security cooperation agreement, which is pretty significant. A lot of their ports are completely untapped. We know it's a future country with young demographics, significant in natural resources, an important player in the larger region. This might be a place to kind of see or test the waters. At the very least, and you move over, and certainly time and space matter. Having a base in Darwin, Australia already is pretty significant. It might be a place where, as initially we can test the waters more here with the naval vessels to then, catapult from there.
Right. Dr. Wise?
Yeah, I think those are great comments. I'm torn on it because in some ways, what I really like about the Seventh Fleet as it stands is it has such a wide, and it has to then think almost beyond the region, has to think almost globally. And I guess I'm not sure. I think that a better resourced Seventh Fleet is a critical need. Okay, so that's either we have a better resourced Seventh Fleet, or we have a collectively more resourced Seventh Fleet plus First Fleet, right? And figure out the details. Whether or not it's another fleet, I think thinking strategically about where bases could be, including permanent bases, is a really interesting concept. And I agree that Indonesia is an opportunity. I would say that if you look at the entire Indochina Peninsula and then extend out to the South Pacific, you have a lot of small island countries and large archipelagic countries that are very concerned about fisheries enforcement. And that's another area where we could think about a combination of smaller US Navy vessels plus maybe some Coast Guard vessels, either offshore patrol vessels or their national security cutters, being able to do fisheries enforcement at the same time as having that, especially the national security cutters, which have a larger crew and just a larger visual presence, that they would give that sort of benefit that you were talking about, Brent, of a port call, not only the vessel itself, but the crew and the interaction and the formalities that come with it. I think there's lots of opportunity there. And so, from my perspective, and I don't know the answer to these things, I'm just a commentator who wants all the sea services to succeed and have more vessels. But basically, whichever path to get more vessels out of Congress for that wide Indo-Pacific region, I'll sign up for that. And I don't know which path is better.
No, I appreciate that. I'm going to weigh in a little bit on Vietnam. We haven't really talked about it. There's some commentary that's coming in from some very esteemed colleagues of ours on the chat line, and I would be remiss to say that Vietnam does play. I don't want to speak for both of my other panelist members, but it's important to point out that only so far, as long as the regime has a Communist Party in power, there's a relationship there that goes back to Beijing that always kind of catches things as before you get to the final yard of a major agreement. Though the aircraft carrier visits were remarkable in the recent past, there's still only so far, despite the animosities between China and Vietnam. That's not to say that it's not a player, it's not a strategic partner. It definitely has that, even though it has strategic relationships with Russia, which I think also can be interestingly used to balance out in the three-way competition, United States, China, and Russia. And that's not to say that those are 3 points of a triangular fight that are equal. And that's by no means the connotation of that. So I think for the sake of time, we'll move on to probably the next, we'll go back to our first survey question. Catherine, if you can call that back up. All right, so this was the same question we had in the beginning. I'm just going to repose it and see if there's any delta, a change from our earlier discussion until now. So where there was a balance between the capacity and contesting the gray zone operations, after our discussion, the majority has definitely moved into building up interoperability and capacity with our partners. Again, this is a theme that's been foundational in national level and certainly geographic combatant commander strategies for upwards of 10 years. So again, I think that reaffirms kind of an opinion that it's shared at the highest levels in the U.S. government and the strategists. There was a few comments I definitely want to, and with the time that we have, I'll let both you, Dr. Weitz and Dr. Gresham, if you have comments on it. And that is the Battle Force 2045, or that I mentioned in my opening comments, was just released yesterday. And when you look in that document, there's a couple of things that are still kind of interest. One is the balance of the force in the immediate future is still going to be on large vessels. But there is a move eventually to have a large number, mostly unmanned, but larger numbers, getting upwards. If you look at it out by the end of the build plan, up to 688 ships on the high end, and upwards about 580 or so on the lower end of when you consider everything all together. One of the comments on the chat line which caught my attention is that kind of structure necessarily still kind of fixates Navy on power projection. So strike, launching cruise missiles into another country. Less developed or designed for these gray zone competition. A large ship with a lot of strike capability, and a small ship with a lot of strike capability. What are your views on that type of platform's utility, and we talked a lot about the smaller vessels, so I don't have to go back into that. But at least my impression is that this fleet structure may not necessarily get at that yet. How say you?
It's a great point. And furthermore, I mean, it gets to my comment about, the South China Sea and why successive Indo-PACOM commanders have been very much concerned about A2AD and larger ships being, sitting ducks when they enter certain areas that are controlled by China. And I think, in looking at the report, it's very much aspirational, which makes good sense. But I think I still come around to the fact that, the dust is yet to settle on COVID-19 and the pandemic and how, the financial constraints are coming. It's just a matter of when. And so thinking creatively and innovatively, then maybe it has to be a difficult decision about not necessarily having the largest ship. And that's why I think perhaps why, or I know for me, emphasizing more of the kind of interoperability is going to be so key, as opposed to getting the next largest ship, which I don't deny. I mean, again, saying that there's real, to your point, Brent, which is a good one and well received. There's a significant, when an aircraft carrier rolls into a port, you feel it, you see it. It's a an enormous, great presence, and this is why China and India and Russia also want aircraft carriers because of this potent national symbol. But I think the reality, is we are going to be financially constrained and having to be very creative and innovative again. Moving forward will be the name of the game.
I'll only add, I do think that autonomous vehicles do have an interesting element here, especially if they can be produced relatively inexpensively. Though my experience with the ocean operating environment is it's very harsh, and and you have to be having some humans there to figure out how to fix things is usually pretty important. So I don't want to be too reliant on it. I don't want the Vietnam piece to pass, because I do think Vietnam and India, because they both have good relations with Russia, both present an opportunity to potentially encourage a little split between, not a full Sino-Soviet or Sino-Russian split, but some kind of split interest there. And I find that Vietnam is pretty good among the Southeast Asian countries as having a very credible small state strategy. So they have a very credible submarine force. They can fight back against any Chinese encroachment, and they want to have more friends. And I'll go back to the point, because I do think an opportunity post-COVID, again, kind of taking the reset button, building on what Jeffrey was talking about with interoperability, is just say, we're going to practice interoperability among these, say, 15 allied navies from the North Atlantic and North Pacific, and we're going to sail from the North Pacific through the, around through the Indian Ocean and into the North Atlantic. That's a pretty global statement that says we're working together, we're practicing, and we have each other's back across the geography. And that would be a signal that I don't think China's received yet.
No, I'm getting some more commentary, but and I really would like to get at it, but it's really I think there's a lot more here to discuss about the partner capacity building. It is something that, and again, I direct our audience's attention to the Heritage website. If you look me up, you can see all of the writings. There will be some that focus more on this security cooperation, and we'll probably have both of you, Dr. Weitz and Dr. Gresh, come on, and maybe we'll dive into this in a part 2 follow-up on the capacity building. But not even on the chat. I'm getting stuff also from my email. So I'm trying fervently to try and get everything together on this remote kind of platform. But more to follow on that. I think, sadly, I'm going to have to say that we are at the end of our time. We've gone a little bit over. I'm very sensitive of both of our panelists' time, as well as members of the audience that have other business to get on to. Again, I appreciate all of your commentary and your thoughts. It will be captured. I've seen it all here, and much appreciated. But again, that appears to be all the time that we have today. I want to thank both my panelists for their time and sharing their expertise, insights on this most important topic, one that we'll definitely have to revisit, as it is a very big and deep topic. The economic military nexus in this maritime great power competition, to be specific, and what could probably be called naval statecraft approaches. And then thank you for your participation, our audience and Heritage Foundation supporters alike. You should receive a follow-up email after we conclude today with recording of this conversation. Should be posted on the web at the Heritage Events webpage. With that, I'll turn it back over to Catherine for any final closing comments. And again, thank you very much.